It was well before dawn on December 5th, 1977. A man crept through the shadows of Tucson, his breath visible in the chill of the night air. He carried a briefcase, but inside, hidden behind false walls, lay murder. That barking dog would be the first warning sign to expose a deranged plot. Because in that bag, the authorities would find Librium, a loaded revolver, tools of intrusion, and even firecrackers. He disguised his face, assumed a false identity, and flew under the radar. But he had underestimated one thing: that obsession can be drilled, bit by bit, into every quiet corner of life. This is the story of Dr. Patrick G. Henry, a doctor, a husband, a plotting killer, and how his careful scheme unraveled under the gaze of suspicion, a vigilant dog, and his own unraveling mind. Welcome to Crime Alley Documentaries. In today's episode, we dive deep into the life and the darkness behind a doctor's assault on the very institution he swore to protect. Patrick had always been an odd one. He was the kind of guy who let his mom dress him all through medical school, a mama's boy, you might say. At first glance, you would think that his mother was the one who had her claws in him. You know, that kind of mom. The kind that has to be the only woman in her son's life. But then he met Christina. She was absolutely beautiful. She had long dark hair. She was warm and sweet. She was vibrant and independent, and she had a local TV program for kids. Christina had always loved kids and was really interested in child psychology, a field she planned to study. But things don't always go as planned. She met Patrick fresh out of medical school, on his way to becoming a successful dermatologist. He was her family's tenant, and they had fallen in love. Christina said yes when Patrick asked her to marry him, and they were married in 1971 in a Greek Orthodox ceremony. Christina was over the moon. He was a rising star, educated, ambitious, with a promising medical career. But early cracks would begin to emerge. They lived in various cities: Tucson, Ann Arbor, New Orleans, Mobile, following Patrick's medical training and career postings. The picture looked perfect, but as Christina would later recall, the veneer was thin. Even though it didn't start out this way, and he seemed to be a really supportive husband, Patrick started giving her the message that her only job was to take care of him. She was in charge of his schedule, what he wore, his meals, everything. At the same time, she was not allowed to have a life of her own. Patrick, little by little, isolated her, not letting her talk to or hang out with her friends, even going as far as insulting her friends just so that they would stay away. And whenever Christina complained about the smallest thing, Patrick would remind her that she was now the wife of a doctor and she was expected to behave in a certain way, be compliant, and just take care of him. But being smart, Christina read between the lines. She knew what he really meant was that no one would ever believe her if she ever said that he was controlling and that the cruelty was getting worse and worse. Patrick started controlling every little transaction and told Christina that she was only to spend like $10 a month, which practically meant that she didn't have the right to buy anything for herself, just enough to make meals. At the same time, he wouldn't let her get a job, even though obviously they did need the money. Out of loneliness and just in desperate need of a companion, Christina got a kitty. But surprise, surprise, Patrick was mean to the cat too. Once he threw the cat against the wall cause he had tried to touch the cat, but the cat had run away. He said to Christina, "Nothing runs from me. Nothing. I hate it when anything runs. It makes me violent." When Christina protested, he threatened, "Don't you ever run. It makes me violent. I'd see you dead first." At times he tormented her with vile fantasies he had, like mechanical torture and dismemberment. He described injecting explosives, using firecrackers internally. He claimed he would crush eyeballs, cause unthinkable pain. These weren't idle statements. They were gut-wrenching whispers from a mind unraveling. Then came the fetish. You see, Patrick was really passionate about photography, but he enjoyed taking inappropriate pictures of Christina, humiliating her in some weird way. Like snapping pictures of her when she had her hair in curlers, when she had a running nose, or when she was vomiting from morning sickness. And yes, Christina got pregnant with their son. But the snapping pictures thing was even worse than you think. Patrick absolutely loved taking pictures of Christina when she was terrified. Once, instead of helping his wife, he started snapping photos of her while, and you won't believe this, she was swimming away from an alligator. He would even start screaming at the top of his lungs while Christina was pregnant and sleeping, just to get her scared enough to be photo-worthy. Then came physical violence. He grabbed a knife and held it to her body while threatening to lock her in the attic, warning that help would arrive too late. I think by this point everyone's just worried about the newborn baby, and believe me, you have the right to be. He wasn't happy about Christina's pregnancy to begin with, and since he believed her world just had to revolve around him, he did not like that baby. One night, Christina woke up to the muffled cries of her son, and when she got to the crib, her baby son was wrapped from head to toe in a blanket so tight he couldn't even breathe. The next morning, when the baby had diarrhea, Patrick gave her some prescription medication and told her to dissolve it in the baby's milk bottle and he would be just fine. By this point, Christina knew something was up and refused to give him the medicine. Later that day, she checked with the pharmacy and realized that the medicine was actually a narcotic and the baby would have died had he taken it. She just stopped sleeping altogether, worried that Patrick would do something to the baby and she wouldn't hear his cries. Christina's world closed in around her. Fear became constant. Sleep was erratic. Every squeal from the baby, every creak in the house triggered panic. At this point, Christina was looking for a way out, and Patrick, being Patrick, knew just how far he had pushed her. So, he kept telling her about daily news revolving around the theme that women who left their husbands would always lose custody cause the judge would just side with the father and grant them full custody. Yet, to the outside world, Dr. Henry remained respectable. He told colleagues he was under stress. He declined psychiatric referral, even as Christina begged him to seek help. She began to plan. She knew she had to escape, not just for her, but for their child. While at a medical convention in New York, Christina arranged a quiet escape. With her sister's help, she and the baby slipped away from Patrick, flying to Tucson without his knowledge. Once safe, she filed for divorce. Patrick pleaded, promised he would change, sent constant letters begging her to return, but Christina stood firm. She would not live under terror again. But then he sent her a newspaper article about a kidnapped child who was found injured in a swamp. Divorce became final in April 1975. Patrick, with his new wife in tow, attempted to maintain ties, particularly custody. He adopted his new wife's daughters and insisted their son would be allowed visitation, but Christina refused. She suspected his motives weren't paternal love, but control and revenge. As custody battles brewed, Patrick's darkness turned outward. By late 1977, Patrick's obsession lurched into preparation. He flew to a medical convention in Dallas, slipped away under an alias, and boarded a flight to Tucson with a singular mission: to kill Christina. Under the alias Donald Wester, he arrived at Tucson International Airport. In his briefcase, he carried a revolver, burglary tools, firecrackers, and sedatives. He disguised himself with a wig, padded clothing, and false identities. He packed tools to break windows: plunger, knives, tape. But then he lost his briefcase and made a scene screaming at everyone to find it, and then left the airport. He then walked to Christina's house and tried to poison the family's dog, stuffing Librium in a piece of meat. The dog vomited, alerting the family. He called Christina's nursery school, pretending to be a parent wanting a tour, to lure her out. She recognized his voice and hung up. He attempted to gain entry to her home, but the barking dog and early morning light got in his way. His plan was unraveling. But why all this effort when he had already lost the briefcase? Well, Patrick had actually filled out a form stating that the airline had lost his briefcase. But you see, he had actually given a false description of his briefcase to give the illusion that he had lost it, which was with him all along. But then, airport staff grew suspicious, security flagged his behavior, and the police were notified. He was arrested when they found all those things in his briefcase. In court, the defense argued that Patrick never carried out the murder, that his plan had dissolved, and that he never attempted to act. Patrick admitted the planning but denied an attempt. Prosecutors assembled compelling evidence. The dog's vomit contained Librium, matching pills found in Patrick's bag. His personal notes were decoded, which read, "Find Tina, murder Tina." The briefcase contained loaded weapon, tools, and disguises. His aliases and padded clothing signaled concealment. The jury considered whether Patrick had crossed from planning into execution, whether acts in furtherance had occurred. They found he had. After about 5 hours of deliberation, he was convicted of attempted murder, second degree, and sentenced to 6.5 years in Arizona State Prison. Later, he attempted to restore his medical license, but the state medical board refused. His reputation was tarnished. But the story did not end there. Patrick was released on parole in the mid-1980s. He attempted reinstatement of his medical credentials, all denied. He worked odd jobs as a medical assistant. In 1987, he was arrested again in Mobile, Alabama, this time accused of conspiring to process marijuana with intent to distribute. Rumors persisted that he plotted further violence, stockpiling materials, threatening retaliation against prosecutors or witnesses. One report says he sharpened a hunting knife and threatened to bomb individuals involved in his trial. His later whereabouts are murky. Some sources claim that by 2013 he had remarried and lived in Portland, Oregon. His medical license was never reinstated. The trust of his profession extinguished. Patrick Henry's case is chilling not only because of the violence, but because it shows how power, control, obsession, and delusion can hide in plain sight. When you look at this case, it's easy to think of it as a story about crime, about a man's obsession and a woman's escape. But beneath the headlines, this is a story about psychology, about what happens when control becomes identity and when survival becomes an act of rebellion. Let's step into that space for a moment. Let's look at what was happening not just in their lives, but in their minds. Patrick Henry's psychological profile reads like a textbook study in what clinicians call malignant narcissism, a rare but dangerous constellation of traits. Coined by social psychologist Erich Fromm and later described by psychiatrist Otto Kernberg, malignant narcissism sits at the crossroads of narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial traits, aggression, and paranoia. Unlike ordinary narcissism, it isn't just about vanity or ego. It's about power, domination for its own sake. Patrick's need for control over Christina wasn't a symptom of love or jealousy. It was the pure expression of ownership. In his world, people were extensions of his will. When she stopped obeying, when she refused to be controlled, he didn't experience sadness. He experienced annihilation. That's what psychologists call narcissistic injury, a deep, humiliating wound to the ego that sparks rage and retaliation. And his background as a physician only made it worse. Doctors are trained to maintain detachment under pressure, to separate emotion from decision. In healthy people, that's professionalism. In Patrick, it became a weapon. He used his clinical distance to justify cruelty, to rationalize horror. He once told Christina that he hated it when anything runs from him. That single statement, psychologists might say, captures the core of psychopathic control. The belief that autonomy is defiance, that defiance must be destroyed. His later behavior, the aliases, disguises, the murder plot, reflected obsessive-compulsive features often found in individuals with high cognitive functionings and antisocial tendencies. He didn't just want to kill her, he wanted to orchestrate her death like a procedure, planned, perfect. Clinical research on intimate partner homicide shows that perpetrators like Patrick share common psychological markers. Entitlement, the belief they have a right to dictate another person's existence. Objectification, seeing the partner as property, not person. Persecutory delusion, believing they are the real victim. Each of these traits surfaced in Patrick's actions. His obsession wasn't impulsive, it was systematic, rehearsed, even ritualistic. And when his plan failed, he didn't feel remorse, he felt cheated. Now let's turn to Christina, the survivor. People often ask, why didn't she leave sooner? But from a psychological perspective, that's the wrong question. The right one is, what did it take for her to leave at all? Christina lived under a regime of what psychologist Dr. Evan Stark calls coercive control, a form of intimate terrorism that uses fear, isolation, and psychological manipulation instead of constant physical violence. In his research, Stark describes coercive control as a liberty crime, the theft of a person's autonomy and sense of self. Christina wasn't just afraid for her life, She was being systematically dismantled. Patrick cut off her financial independence. He monitored her every move. He decided when she could sleep, when she could speak, when she could drive. This isn't love, it's psychological imprisonment. Over time, survivors internalize that control. They begin to doubt their perceptions, blame themselves, even rationalize their abuser's behavior. Psychologists call this trauma bonding, the emotional tether that forms between a victim and abuser through alternating abuse and affection. Patrick's apologies, his pleas, his manipulative tenderness, those moments reinforced the bond. Christina wasn't naive, she was conditioned, and yet she escaped. That moment, arranging her getaway while he attended a medical convention, was more than physical flight. It was cognitive revolution. She reclaimed her agency. Psychologically, that decision marks the breaking of the trauma bond, the moment when fear becomes clarity. In abuse psychology, that's known as reclaiming narrative control, the first true step towards survival. But survival came with its own scars. Victims of coercive control often experience complex PTSD, a long-term trauma response marked by hypervigilance, guilt, emotional numbness, and chronic anxiety. Even after safety, the mind keeps replaying danger. Christina's resilience, her refusal to be silenced, shows another pattern: post-traumatic growth. The phenomenon where trauma survivors develop profound strength, insight, and purpose from their ordeal. She didn't just survive Patrick, she outgrew the world he tried to cage her in. In the end, Patrick and Christina weren't just husband and wife. They were opposing psychological forces, predator and survivor, control and resistance. Patrick's pathology demanded submission. Christina's humanity refused to yield. That collision was inevitable. Psychologists who analyze such cases often highlight the cycle of abuse: tension, explosion, remorse, and calm. A loop that resets itself again and again. Patrick's cycle, however, broke at the remorse stage. He never felt guilty. He only felt escalation. That's what makes malignant narcissism so volatile. It feeds on its own failure. Each rejection becomes proof that more control is needed. Each loss becomes a call for revenge. Christina's defiance then was more than survival. It was existential rebellion. Her escape shattered the illusion Patrick built, that he was untouchable, omnipotent, the center of every orbit. When the police opened his briefcase, they weren't just uncovering a crime. They were cracking open the psyche of a man undone by his own delusion. The Patrick Henry case reminds us that the mind can be both the weapon and the battlefield. It reminds us that abusers don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear white coats, speak softly, and hide behind intellect. And it reminds us that survival isn't just about running. It's about remembering who you are when someone has spent years convincing you that you're nothing. Patrick Henry lost his license, his freedom, and his mask. But Christina, she reclaimed something far greater: her voice, her life, her truth. The case of Patrick Henry lives on not just as a cautionary tale, but as a reflection of how easily safety can be breached, and how courage, vigilance, and instinct can prevail. Thank you for joining me on Crime Alley Documentaries. If you found this episode compelling, share it with someone who believes in listening, in vigilance, and in justice.